those of you who are not familiar with the high-level panel of experts for food security and nutrition, HLPE, it's a science policy interface for the World UN Committee on World Food Security, sometimes referred to as the IPCC for food security and nutrition. And today I'll be applying insights from past HLPE reports on climate, water, and food security to a Botswana case study. So I'm going to start by summarize some of our current understanding of climate, water, food security, and nutrition. Then I'll briefly present findings from past reports put out annually by the HLPE on climate change, and then water. And then I'll summarize sort of an updated understanding of food security and nutrition from a 2020 report, before getting into a case study in Botswana, which really focuses on female gardeners, their level of commercialization, access to water, and then food security. And then I will conclude. So, based on the sixth assessment put out last year by the IPCC, we know that global surface temperatures are going to continue to increase through the mid-century under all emission scenarios. Global warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. Continued climate change is projected to further impact aspects of the global water cycle. There will be sea level rise occurring at the fastest rates in the past 3,000 years. Drought incidence is increasing in many regions. Oceans are warming, acidifying, and losing oxygen. Some regions of the world are experiencing more intense and heavier rainfall. We're seeing complex changes to the monsoon cycle, and many of these changes are irreversible, including the unprecedented retreat of glaciers. There's a two-way relationship between climate change, food security, and nutrition. Climate change is both impacting food systems, and food system activities are also driving climate change. Climate change affects agriculture and food systems, for example, by affecting food production and storage through increases in drought, occurrence of extreme weather events, but also through impacts on water availability and quality, pests, and diseases. In recent years, for example, yields of staple crops such as maize, wheat, sorghum, and fruit crops like mangoes have decreased across Africa, widening food insecurity gaps. Increased attention has also been paid in recent years to food systems' contributions to climate change. According to the IPCC, between 21 and 37% of greenhouse gas emissions are from food systems. More specifically, we have high confidence that nitrous oxide concentration trends since 1980 are largely driven by a 30% increase in emissions from the expansion and intensification of global agriculture. So now turning to HLPE reports. First, the report that came out in 2012 on climate change and food. The report looks at the effects of climate change on agricultural production and proposes both mitigation and adaptation strategies. The report spends a fair amount of time looking at the concept of vulnerability, which is often broken down into three components. What's the magnitude of the climate shock, like a drought? What is the exposure of a livelihood to this shock? And what is the ability of a livelihood to bounce back or to be resilient? And so while we might think of a shock, something like a drought, as a biophysical phenomena, exposure and resilience are often shaped by socioeconomic factors. The report identifies sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa as the world's most vulnerable regions, and pastoralism as the most vulnerable livelihood. The report emphasizes the need to embed climate change adaptation in efforts to improve food security and nutrition, build more resilient food systems, pay attention to the needs and rights of small farmers and the most vulnerable. The key messages of the report are still valid. We need to pursue synergies in food security and climate change actions, increase resilience of food systems to climate change, and develop low emissions agricultural strategies that contribute to food security. Some things have changed since this time. We now have a better understanding of how agriculture is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And at the time, agroecology was not a widely accepted strategy. Now it increasingly is accepted, and it is a path forward. Turning now to the report on water, it assesses the multiple linkages between water and food security and nutrition, including those beyond agriculture, through an ecosystem-based approach to integrate management of water, land, and living resources. Attention is paid to the technical, institutional, and socioeconomic, cultural, and political dimensions. Access to water is often shaped by socioeconomic factors, gender, and power relations. The stability of access to water is influenced by climate change and rainfall variability. This diagram from that report shows the sort of multiple linkages between water and food security. Water is clearly used to grow and prepare food, and declining water quality impacts these activities. But food systems also impact water resources in terms of water pollution, diversion for agricultural activities, and the imports and exports of virtual water, which is the water content contained in grain production. The key messages of this report are also still valid. We need to ensure sustainable management and conservation of ecosystems for the continued availability, quality, and stability of water, ensure an integrated approach to water and food security and nutrition-related policies, prioritize the most vulnerable and marginalized, improve water management, foster an inclusive and effective governance of water, and then promote a rights-based approach to the governance of water and food security and nutrition. HLPE's report number 15 in 2020 expanded our understanding of the concept of food security. Traditionally, it had 4 pillars: availability, access, utilization, and stability. And it proposes adding an additional 2 dimensions: agency and stability. And agency refers to individuals and groups' ability to affect decisions about what they eat, what foods they produce, how that food is produced. And sustainability has to do with the long-term viability of food systems. So agency, which is tightly connected to concepts and approaches like food sovereignty, is critical for better understanding how food systems interact with water resources and climate. Agency is often situated. For example, because it's shaped by governance and political economy. For example, it may make sense to grow more drought-tolerant and nutritious crops like sorghum in Southern Africa as rainfall becomes more irregular. But people are instead growing more maize because this is where we've spent most of our research dollars, and so it's problematic from that perspective. In terms of sustainability, it helps us think about the long-term interactions between water, climate, and food systems. Oftentimes we have maladapted food production systems which undermine the resource base and contribute to the degradation of water and climate resources. I'm now going to turn to the case study on Botswana. This is in part based on my own research, but also based on research that I have done with a co-author, Rachel Fair. So for those of you who don't know about Botswana, it's located in Southern Africa. It's a country about the size of Texas, and it's one of the least densely populated countries in the world. It has about 2 million people. It's semi-arid. This is where the Kalahari Desert is located. Crop agriculture is quite marginal and female dominated, and the primary agricultural activity is cattle ranching, which tends to be more male dominated. And here we explore issues of sort of access to water and commercialization among women who are increasingly engaged in gardening activity. So in Botswana, large central part of the country is the Kalahari Desert, where you have very low rainfall levels, but in the northeast and the southeast, you have rainfall levels of 400 to 600 millimeters a year. where you see sorghum and maize production. It's in the southeastern part of the country where the majority of the population lives. In downscaled climate change models, it's predicted that there'll be a 50 to 100 millimeter decline in rainfall levels. In many cases, this is going to bring us below that 400 millimeter annual threshold, which makes sort of viability for rain-fed agriculture, and temperature increases of 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. Cattle is the main agricultural activity in the country, done in the dryland areas. It represents 80% of the agricultural sector, 85% of exports. Many urban elites also invest in cattle, leading to an increase in the size of the national herd. And there's been a lot of public sector investment, particularly in boreholes, to support the cattle industry. Crop agriculture is much more marginalized. In research we've done, about a fifth of people report that changes in weather are impacting their access to food. In smaller studies looking at farmers, it's become clear that female farmers are increasingly moving away from sorghum, which is more drought tolerant, and they're moving into maize production, which is very counterintuitive because maize is more susceptible to droughts, but it really has to do with labor constraints and how less labor is required for maize production. So the thing to keep in mind is that in Botswana, even though it's a middle income country, so it's done quite well, there is persistent inequality. It has one of the highest levels of inequality in the world, and related to this are high levels of food insecurity and the marginalization of women, as well as economic activities, pro-poor economic activities that would support the food security of women. So we did a study which was published in 2019, looking at 100 women in 7 villages near the capital city of Gaborone. And we were looking at various levels of commercialization. Some women were highly commercialized, some were somewhere in the middle, and some were more subsistence. And we were looking at measures of food security, basically using the Household Food Insecurity Access Scale, as well as measures of dietary diversity. The other important variable was access to water. So some of these women live near rivers, and so they get water using pumps. Other women have boreholes, and other women are using tap water. But in all 3 cases, they're using shade netting and drip irrigation in order to sort of minimize loss to evapotranspiration. Final couple of slides here, and they're a bit counterintuitive. The most food secure group is the group that is using boreholes. This makes sense because there's a high barrier of entry. You need capital to invest in a borehole. Then the second most food secure group is the women who have access to river water, and then those who use tap water, which is the poorest group. Now, in terms of commercialization, increasing commercialization results in decreases in food insecurity for the tap water group and for the borehole group, but it's the reverse for the river water group. And the reason for this is that it doesn't require a big expense to access river water, and so nutrition, food security increases when you consume more of your own vegetables rather than selling those. For the other 2 groups, those that have to purchase tap water or those who have to pay for a borehole, you need to commercialize in order to cover those expenses. And now I'll just sort of move to my last slide. So we examine the relationship between commercially oriented gardeners that have access to borehole water, tap water, and river water. Food security status improves with commercial orientation only for those women who have experience with the commercial market and those who have to deal with these water costs. But for other women who don't have to cover those costs, it makes more sense to be more subsistence oriented. And I think very central to this study is the idea of agency. that we need to improve the agency of women, improve their access to water in order to improve their food security. And this small-scale gardening activities are much more sustainable than rain-fed agriculture or the cattle industry in the country. Thank you very much.